All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Claire Carrington. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Blockchain Consortium. And today's webinar is actually more of a class. We've been looking at the idea of teaching some classes for a bit of time now, as opposed to just the panelist style webinar conversation. So our first one is Understanding Bitcoin, the world's first digital currency. So I always like to start off a little bit by talking about who the CBC is and what we do. So the Canadian Blockchain Consortium, we actually started as the Alberta Blockchain Consortium by this amazing lady named Suzanne West way back in, well, not I guess way back, but back in 2017, she came up with this really incredible idea because she wanted to see how oil and gas companies could learn to be technology companies with oil assets as opposed to oil and gas companies learning how to adopt technology. And she saw blockchain as a way to help support the oil and gas sector and create better efficiency and transparency. So from that time, unfortunately, she had passed away, and myself and Dave Bradley decided to take on this, the ABC and turn it into this nice large organization. So prior to COVID, we're really enjoying doing in-person events. So we always did what we called our Thursday Wine and Cheese, where people would come in on the first and last Thursday of every month in Calgary and Edmonton, and we'd host similar events, either panel style or education style in person. We do larger events. We get involved in advocacy, education, research projects, mentorship. So we're a really fascinating organization. If you want to learn more about us, canadablockchain.ca is our website. Of course, we're a not-for-profit organization, so we couldn't do what we do without our incredible members who support our groups. We'd like to thank everyone on this slide today. And then a big shout out to today's sponsors, so BitVo and Bitcoin Solutions. So BitVo is on a mission to become Canada's premier currency exchange. They're based in Calgary. Their CEO is this powerhouse woman named Pam. They're focused on customer service, security, and transparency. And they make cryptocurrency trading accessible for all Canadians. And then our other sponsor is Bitcoin Solutions. So they actually specialize in ATMs, and they're all across Western Canada. They do online transfers, in-person brokering. They ensure that you get your Bitcoin as fast as possible and very safely. And I really love that they're completely compliant with all AML and KYC regulations to ensure that their services are safe. So accessibility is their specialty. So if you're looking at purchasing your Bitcoin, you can go through Bitcoin Solutions. If you're looking at putting it onto an exchange, you can look at BitVo. So these two are wonderful, great companies, and we know the people who run them. We love when people engage with us. So we do have Q&A. So Dave and I are going to go through the class for about 45 minutes, and then you can put as many questions as you like into the Q&A, and we'll try to get through all of them as best as we can. We do love engaging with our community, so you can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. And if you like anything or anything that you've learned from this conversation, please make sure to tag it on Twitter. Our hashtag is Canada Blockchain. One of the things that we also really love doing is finding ways to give back to the community. So for the whole month of May, so we only have a few days left, we were doing, for any new follower that we got on social media who tagged us in a happy, uplifting message, we're donating $1 to Brown Bagging It for Kids. And we're so grateful, the CEO of YY Tech Consulting, John, who's also matching our donation. So we're doing now $2 for everyone who does this. And Brown Bagging It for Kids is a really great organization because what they do is they support making sure that children don't go hungry. And right now during COVID, they're actually not just doing this for children, but making sure that families don't go hungry. They've been around for 30 years. They're a wonderful group of people. We love supporting them. And one of the reasons why we also want to get people to tag uplifting messages is because we know during COVID, it hasn't exactly been a very happy time for many people. So we thought that the more encouraging and positive messages that we can put on social media, the better. So if you aren't already following us, please do so. Tag us in something uplifting, and everyone does go donates to children. So today's event, Understanding Bitcoin. So it's a rare example of the first iteration of technology that has actually kept its dominance. And it's still by far the most successful use case for blockchain technology. So we're going to discuss kind of why hasn't Bitcoin gone the way of MySpace, you know, how like Facebook took over MySpace. And this special presentation is designed to help the average person understand what makes Bitcoin so special and relevantly important. And I'm really excited for my co-educator here today, Dave Bradley, who's also the co-founder of the Canadian Blockchain Consortium, discussing this. So Dave has a really incredible career. He is probably the longest standing Bitcoin broker. He had the very first brick and mortar Bitcoin store in the world. He didn't sell physical Bitcoins, but he did sell Bitcoins through his store. He's probably one of the more knowledgeable experts, the most knowledgeable that I've met in Canada, I would have to say. So he's an incredible wealth of knowledge. He's got a new startup now called Ghost Labs, which is going to be like a software solutions provider to Bitcoin ATMs. If I didn't get that right, Dave, I'm really sorry. You can explain that better. So much for helping us have this conversation today. And so a little bit about our learning overview. So we went through a little bit of it about us. So we're going to talk first about Bitcoin basics. Some of my favorite things to discuss are essentials of cryptography, and then a history of money, proof of work. So why this is kind of important, why we pick this, is because a lot of people might have like misconceptions on what this technology actually is, the technologies that actually make up Bitcoin, and some of the essential aspects of why it's considered money. So this is kind of how we're getting into that today. So a bit on Bitcoin basics, and Dave's going to pop in every time, especially if I say something incorrect. So in 2008, it actually started as a white paper from a group of developers that called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto. So there's some controversy, either it's a single individual or a group of people who came up with this concept, but the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto is actually kind of important because in Japan, the name Satoshi Nakamoto is kind of the equivalent to the name John Smith in North America. So it's a very, very common name. So they picked something where you wouldn't be able to specifically identify whoever the person was who created it. So that's kind of why no one knows exactly who Satoshi is, but they attempted to create what's called sound money that's not subject to government inflation. And we'll talk about why that's also important. So then fast track to a year after the very first Bitcoin was mined, or the very first Genesis block was mined, it actually had its very first transactions. The first time it was considered like a medium of exchange or a form of kind of like trade value and barter. It was someone purchased 2 Papa John's pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoins. Now at the time, the way they actually created kind of like that relevance for how much this pizza would be worth, they were looking at how much it cost them to actually mine that many Bitcoin. So at the time, it was only costing you, I guess, like maybe $25, $30 to mine 10,000 Bitcoins. Don't we all wish we would have got into it way back then? Because today's value, those 2 pizzas are like $130 million. Doesn't that guy wish he didn't buy those pizzas? I don't know. But it's really significant that this happened because it started off as kind of like a concept. It started off wanting to be money with literally zero value whatsoever. And somebody within a year recognized that it had value and bartered for that value and created like kind of like the first recognizable instance where Bitcoin became a form of money. So we fast track again, now within only 3 years, it's 2012, and it's actually started getting this option with about 1,000 merchants at this time, and people worldwide accepting this. There were exchanges that came up and people were willing to barter and trade this for goods or services. Now move forward a little bit further to 2017. So not today, but 2017. This one's significant. It's because it's where it hit parity with gold. Now, gold took about 1,600 years to get to the value of like, what, $1,200 per ounce. And it took Bitcoin a very short time, less than a decade, to hit that same parity. And it's never dropped below the value of gold since 2017, which is also important to note. So today, hundreds of thousands of merchants globally are accepting this, from companies like Amazon to Microsoft to Virgin. And even in Japan, it's actually recognized as a currency that you can purchase things with. I know, Dave, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's all pretty good. I wouldn't say Amazon is taking Bitcoin, but
oh, sorry, that's right.
But other than that, yeah, I mean, it's exploding now as a means of payment all over the world.
Fantastic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Bitcoin basics, and this is where I'm going to leave it to Dave to explain this one because he does it so much better than myself. So we're going to talk a little bit about nodes, decentralization, immutability. Dave, you want to kick this one off?
Sure. Yeah. So the Bitcoin blockchain is essentially a database that controls the information of who has what Bitcoins. And so that's a very important piece of information. And that's what allows Bitcoin to be this very hard form of money that we're going to get to later. And so the key features, like we've got on the slide here, the Bitcoin blockchain is decentralized. It's by far the most decentralized blockchain. It's run by a series of nodes around the world that are, pseudo-anonymous, and it is a way for this group of people who don't necessarily know or trust each other to agree on this one single very important set of facts, and that is who has what money. It's very important also that it's immutable. That characteristic is fairly unique to Bitcoin. Part of the reason for that is because there's no one in charge, and so there's no central bank, there's no issuing body, and there's no founder. Talking about that, the anonymous founder Satoshi Nakamoto, if you look at every other sort of competing form of cryptocurrency, they all have someone in charge, and most of them have an instance at some point in their past where the founder has decided to make a choice that has affected the money. And so that's very important, is that it's immutable and no one can actually change that. And that last piece, transparent.
Dave, I think you froze.
I look not frozen on my screen.
Okay, must have just been mine.
Okay, that last piece, transparent, means that it's completely auditable. So all of this information is out there publicly, and all of the nodes in the network share a copy of this database, and they all check that database against each other. And so we know that no one has broken the rules. We know that no one has changed the state of the network and who has which Bitcoins in a way that doesn't line up with the rules of the network.
Fantastic, thank you. So moving on, so a bit more on the basics of it. So collaborative. Bitcoin is a very collaborative effort of developers on open source software who work together. So there is a group called Bitcoin Core, and they work very strongly and collaboratively together to make sure that the Bitcoin network stays pretty secure. In terms of decentralized, so each node of a Bitcoin network hosted by a company or individual stores the entire encrypted blockchain ledger. So that means everybody, and it doesn't just have to be like miners, but anybody can download the entire history of every single transaction that's ever happened on Bitcoin. Decentralized, if you're not familiar with that term, so to explain centralized, if you think of a large company like IBM is in 100% complete control of their information. And if they want to alter any of their information or delete any of their information, they're completely capable of doing so because they've centralized that system and they have a single point of authority or control. When you have something decentralized, it means the same information and the same access is shared between multiple different computers and multiple different parties that all have access to it. So trying to change something means you'd have to have consensus or agreement from a large part of that network. So it's more transparent if you have things that are decentralized versus centralized. And then misunderstood. So Bitcoin is sometimes has like an undeserved reputation as like a get rich quick scheme. So people make this assumption that, oh, get into Bitcoin, you're going to make, all this money instantaneously. It's the people who actually got into it back in 2009 or 10, who held their Bitcoins until today that have made a fair bit of money, but that is not a get rich quick scheme. That is years and years of holding it through a very volatile market. It's not something that you get into it today, you're going to make all this money, within 2 or 3 days. So it's based on sound mathematics as well as economics, more based on Austrian economics and cybersecurity principles. So it's not just something that's been used for dark web transactions. Of course, I think Andreas Antonopoulos said it best: if you couldn't buy drugs with it, it's not considered money, because it's one of the, I think, was it top 2 or 3 things purchased with money would be drugs. So if you couldn't buy that with it, it wouldn't actually be money. Not that I advocate for purchasing drugs by any means necessary, but in other words, it does have a bit of an undeserved reputation, because that's what people think it's only been used for, which is absolutely not the case. And in terms of consensus, so in reality, Bitcoin security is a form of consensus where all participants view prior transactions and agree on a single set of facts. So you cannot actually alter Bitcoin's records. You can't create like a double spend. If you tried to alter the records, and you didn't have 75% consensus of the network, it wouldn't work. And the most important thing about that aspect is nobody really knows who's supporting the network. It's all done by miners. Miners don't, unless they're like larger companies, most people don't actually announce what they're doing. And you need multiple miners to confirm just a single transaction to be able to allow it into a network. So it is definitely fairly secure from that aspect. Dave, anything to add?
Well, I think that's fairly accurate. I would take this slide, I guess, in a little bit different direction, because I think this is a little bit old. It is important that Bitcoin is a store of value. It's important that Bitcoin is money, as we keep saying. And I guess the way that I would simplify it is to say, you know, Bitcoin is money, and the point of money is that we want to take the value that we create with our time, and we want to store that value to use it later. So money is basically an agreement that we use to move value over time and space. And dollars, which is the dominant form of money in the world right now, are pretty bad at that, because the government, you know, is always printing more. And so the longer you hold your value in dollars, the less it holds its value. And that's where Bitcoin is better, is because the government has no way of printing more Bitcoins.
Very true. You almost said that slide verbatim, actually. This was taken off a Dave Bradley tweet, actually, so part of this slide. Part of also saying that your money decreases in value. So if you're familiar with the term inflation, so the government creates inflation at a rate of, I believe, 6% per annum. And it actually means that the value of your money decreases by 6% per year. So you have no, what Saifedean would call time preference. If you have $100 today, next year, it's not going to be worth the same amount. Your spending power is going to decrease every single year that you hold that money, because the government is going to perform quantitative easing and continue to push more money out into the market. And that really messes up with supply and demand. So when you have something like Bitcoin that you are absolutely not able to recreate, you cannot produce more than the 21 million Bitcoins that has been put into the Genesis block that was mined. You have a limited supply, and you can create an unlimited demand based on the amount of populace that we have in the world. But the government can't come in and say, all right, we're issuing more Bitcoins and creating more inflation and decreasing the value of your Bitcoin. So that part is pretty important. So this one is really interesting. So this is from the chairman of the X Prize Foundation. He said, so at its core, Bitcoin is a smart currency that's designed by very forward-thinking engineers. It eliminates the needs for banks. It gets rid of credit card fees, currency exchange fees, money transfer fees, and reduces the needs for lawyers and transactions. So a little bit about that, why I would say it would reduce the need for banks. So people are very used to not having like self-sovereignty over their own funds. They're used to getting their paycheck, putting it into a bank, and the bank is now responsible for keeping your funds safe. With Bitcoin, it creates more of a self-sovereignty, because you should be responsible to hold your own coins if you have them. It is not a good idea at any point in time to just leave them on an exchange. It's been a proven track record that doing so gives you a risk of losing your coins. because again, you're pretty much putting your coins into a centralized kind of location when you're trusting an exchange to hold your coins, as opposed to keeping them in cold storage. Getting rid of credit card fees. So right now, credit card just racks up debt. It means you're spending money that you don't have, so you can purchase things with the intent of paying it off in the future. But if you think of that, you know, beautiful $150 pair of shoes, if it takes you 6 months to pay it off, you've probably now paid, you know, $225 for that pair of shoes because of all the interest that you're racking up at like 19.9%. So Bitcoin eliminates that because you only spend what you actually have. In terms of currency exchange fees, it's really good because you can send Bitcoin from Canada to any other part in the world, and it can be verified very quickly, and they can withdraw it within their own currency. So you're not paying that currency exchange fee that you would see at the banks and spending more money. But that's also kind of lumped into those money transfer fees, like what you'd be paying with like a PayPal, et cetera. And in terms of reducing the need for lawyers, the underlying technology for Bitcoin, which is blockchain, has a way of auto-executing contracts based on pre-programmed business logic. So you can execute what they call like a smart contract pretty quickly and effectively without having to go through like an intermediary like a lawyer. So now we're going to get into a little bit of elements of cryptography. This one's more my favorite section. So a lot of people might not be quite familiar with the term cryptography, but you might be familiar with the term encryption. So encryption is something that you use every single day with probably not even knowing that you're using it, in your banking passwords, in your password vaults, in, you know, anything that requires you to kind of like put in your username and password. If you see that little secure box, encryption is kind of like the underlying security, but what encryption really is actually cryptography. So it's pretty much private and secure. It has a very lengthy history of use, and we're going to get into a bit of the history later on as well. So essentially, it just means like a person takes a message and encodes it in such a way that if the unintended party gets it and reads it, they won't be able to understand what the original intent of the message is. But the actual reader who it's intended for could access the meaning based on being given a key. So it's really interesting that way. So you can kind of like keep your, I don't know if you were a kid and you ever saw those like invisible pens, you could write your friend a note and then you put a little light on it, you'd be able to see it. Very, very basic idea. But in other words, just not everyone can see what you're trying to do there. So along with blockchain technology and proof of work, electronic cryptography is one of the fundamental technologies underlying Bitcoin. So to get into a bit of the history, I love this part. So one of its first recorded uses was actually in about 1900 BC, and it was found in the tomb of an Egyptian nobleman. And you fast forward to about 100 BC, and even Caesar himself was known to use cryptography to pass along secret messages to his army generals. So when they actually found it in that Egyptian tomb, they noticed a couple hieroglyphs were actually different than all the other hieroglyphs in different tombs, which meant that they were purposely trying to encode a message or keep something private, keep something secret. And it was really interesting trying to decipher that. So then fast track move forward. If anyone would have seen movies that were based anywhere between like 1700s and people were passing notes and they would have had a little cipher key trying to decipher it, normally like royals or something like that. So you would have kind of seen that in movies. Now get into military, and their views on encryption was like an essential part of their tools because they added cryptography to the US munitions list in 1970. And the reason they did it was because the invention of the Enigma machine happened in World War I and was the critical reason that they won World War II. So the Enigma machine was the very first time that cryptography went digital. So it was a very, very large computer, very difficult, but the Germans had a very specific cipher and the Americans were trying to determine what that cipher was to figure out what all these messages meant. And when they were able to crack that code, they realized that cryptography was very, very special, and putting it on the US munitions list meant that if you used cryptography or tried to sell something that was cryptographic, you were now considered a terrorist. So now we move forward to kind of government control of cryptography. So the government created what we call DES, which was a data encrypted standard. They created themselves because they also had a backdoor into it. If you were using DES software, they could automatically see everything that you were doing, even though they claimed that they couldn't. It was a 40-bit code, so basically very, very low level of security considering today's standards. And it was released to the public after civil rights activists demanded greater security in the 90s. So this is pretty much like the father of what we call like the crypto wars. So Phil Zimmermann, he was an American computer scientist and cryptographer who created PGP, which was considered pretty good privacy. And it's the most widely used email encryption software currently in the world today that completely kicks the crap out of DES. But he came under fire from the American government. And it was interesting because he'd actually like written a book on PGP, and it was like 256-bit encryption. If he wrote it in a book, the military or the government didn't see it was a bad thing. But the second he tried to put it digital or put it onto a floppy disk, it was considered an act of terrorism. So he actually it was a civil rights movement that took him many, many years to win. I think it was about 20 years. And finally in 1996, Bill Clinton wrote cryptography off the US munitions list. But even then, the NSA did not want to allow for anything above DES or their 40-bit encryption to be used. So they actually developed out a hackathon where it took 2 years and multiple groups coming together. And until they were able to hack the NSA's DES within less than 24 hours, I believe it was 22 hours, until that point, then the NSA said, okay, fine, you can use a form of this kind of software. So it was, and then blockchain or Bitcoin came out in 2008. So only 8 years after 256-bit encryption came out was Bitcoin actually invented.
Yeah, I should tell a short story about Phil Zimmermann. So we, back when we were still doing physical events, I was hoping to get him as a speaker at one of our conferences. And I tracked him down, got him on the phone, had a pretty interesting conversation with him. And one of the really interesting things that came out of that conversation was that he's very angry at the fact that the blockchain and cryptocurrency space has co-opted the word crypto. He doesn't like that means like cryptocurrency now to a lot of people. He's like, no, it means cryptography.
Yeah.
Don't use it that way. So we can abandon the word crypto for that use.
That would be lovely, actually, because a lot of people, there's a negative thought process around the word crypto. So, and again, this is not a direct person we're quoting, but a part of the white paper. So with e-currency-based cryptographic proof, without the need to trust a third-party middleman, money can be secure and transactions can be effortless. So now we're going to get a little bit into the history of money, and this is definitely where like Dave's knowledge will overpower mine here. But I also find this really, really fascinating because if you think of Bitcoin, multiple things make it up. There's a privacy and security, and like we just talked about the history of cryptography, which means that from 1900 BC till present, it's literally been something that's been evolving, which is fascinating. And now you get into the history of money and a little bit about Keynesian versus Austrian economics and sound money principles. It's another layer that makes up Bitcoin. So history of money. So originally around 6000 BC, people would have used barter and trade. Now, the idea around that is you would have had like a shell, you would have had a cow, you would have had a chicken, you would have had something that you were able to make on your own. And you would have said, okay, my cow is worth so many of the good I'd like to exchange it for. The difficulty with the barter and trade or using certain items as a medium of exchange is at the time, it's not like you could take one cow and break it into like 50 pieces. Somebody generally wanted the whole cow. And if what they were giving you wasn't fully worth the cow, you had to wait to trade that cow till you found something that equaled into that value. So it was not the greatest medium of exchange back then, but they used other things like salt, tea, tobacco, seeds, were very popular trade commodities at the time. So move forward, and only about 1,000 years later, they start introducing metal objects, so kind of creating that medium of exchange. So if you want to exchange that cow for that chicken, you could use metal money as well. And then by about 7000 BC, the Lydians became one of the first in the Western world to make it out of coins. And coins would have been something used for thousands and thousands of years until paper money came into play. And paper money didn't really come into play until the last couple hundred years, I would say. It's non-precious coinage, and basically paper money is an IOU. If you ever like look and read your money, it basically just means like backed by the government. It used to actually mean backed by gold. So before Nixon took the US off of the gold standard, the money would have been actually, you could have exchanged that note, that IOU, for an actual piece of gold. Now you are absolutely unable to do that because they don't have gold anymore. But the reason why they call the term fiat, so if you would have been familiar in that like blockchain Twitter, getting into that space, you hear the term fiat. It basically is Latin for let it be done. And the money is now given value by the government by a decree. So very fascinating. And now moving into digital. So your money has actually been going digital since the invention of the check in the 1950s. Another really interesting note, that the US dollar has decreased in value by 80% since the 1950s. So imagine what you could have bought with $20 back then and what you're going to buy now. Back then, it was a whole like grocery cart full of groceries. Today, you're lucky if it's a bag, and that's probably a light bag as well. So for digital money, as it started becoming digital with the check, after that, it would have been the credit card, and then you would have seen the debit card. Now, about 90% of your currency is digital, evidenced by holding less cash. So right now, if you go into the bank, for every $1 you put in, they can loan out about 20. That's part of the quantitative easing aspects of it. And they prefer digital money because it's much easier to produce it. So in America, you have about 184 trillion in digital circulation, with only about 18.4 trillion in actual physical cash. So if everyone tried to get their money, only 10% of people would actually get their money out. That's another one of the dangers of quantitative easing and lender.
Yeah, it's worth, before you change the slide there, I think it's worth thinking about that progression and moving from barter to trade all the way to digital money. Throughout that time, most of what has been improved upon is the medium of exchange. And that's like the simplest attribute of money is that medium of exchange. And so, you move from something very, very inconvenient like tobacco and gradually get more and more convenient to the point of tap with your debit card. And at the same time, one of the other aspects of money, its ability to store value, has been getting worse. And so right from that point of metal money, that money was inherently scarce. There was only so much metal that you can pull out of the ground. Ever since then, the actual meaning of that contract that money is supposed to represent, that we can, we create some value that we can use later, has been eroded. And that's where we're at now, is this digital money that is very convenient to use for spending, but virtually meaningless as a long-term way to store value.
Sorry. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about the gold standard. So one of my favorite kind of time periods in history would be considered the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, it was almost considered like that time of enlightenment, but the world was based on the gold standard. And areas where their economies, art, philosophy, things flourished were because of the fact that you could only spend what was in your coffers. You couldn't create money out of thin air. You had to spend the gold that you had. And the kings that didn't try to wage war and kept, their ecosystems thriving were usually the ones that had pretty much the most art, the most culture, the most interest. And what happened was people felt safe in their money. They knew that their gold would still be worth something tomorrow. So it created what's called time preference. If you know your money is only going to either stay stable in its value or increase in its value, you're more likely to hold it. Where today, we're based on a Keynesian economic principle, which is spend theory. So our governments believe that giving, like, the more money in the economy, the more people are spending, the more it stimulates the economy, the more you raise up the value. And the issue with that is it's being proven today that that is absolutely not the case. If you would have given an example back in 2008, when you had that housing bubble, it's because of the fact that banks went, hey, here's like a subprime mortgage and your house is only worth $250,000. Well, here's $300,000. Go buy a boat, stimulate the economy. And then when the markets kind of start to crash or correct, they're going to start calling the value of your home versus what you still owe on it. Now, most people would have taken the money given to them by the banks and gone, sweet, now I'm going to go spend it. So they're not able to repay that loan call, which is the reason for an incredible amount of foreclosures. In some areas, it was 1 in every 4 houses was being foreclosed. So spend theory doesn't make a lot of sense. Saving does not mean you're going to hurt the economy. It just means like saving is something that's very important. Picking what you want to put your dollars towards is kind of like voting with your money. You're going to take more time, have more preference, decide what you want really, as opposed to going, well, I better spend my money now. So in Venezuela, if you get a paycheck, you better cash it all out and buy food today, because by tomorrow, you might be able to buy less food with that money. That's what happens when you produce too much money into the economy. So when, in terms of gold, in which the currency could be exchanged, the gold standard was generally abandoned. So around the 1930s. But this was not without some misgivings. So according to Franklin Roosevelt, we have gold because we cannot trust governments. This was literally from like President Hubert Hoover famously warned about the 1933 statement. We have gold because we cannot trust governments. In other words, gold is something that there's a finite resource. You cannot recreate it. Alchemists have tried. You cannot produce more of it. And it's difficult to get to. You spend a lot of time, you spend a lot of money, and you spend a lot of resources grabbing a small quantity of gold, which is why it's held so much value. Bitcoin, you have to spend time, you have to spend money, which is resource to build out the equipment, and it's difficult to get to. So that's kind of where those two have a level of parity. So Hoover had foreseen one of the most draconian events in US financial history, the Emergency Banking Act, which forced Americans to convert their gold to coins. So you were not allowed to have it. If they figured out you still had your gold, you were forced to give it up into certificates to fiat dollars. This legislation successfully stopped the outflow of gold from the US during the Great Depression. Anything to add to that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important point that you touched on there is the fact that it's difficult to get. The gold is difficult to get, and so it's it's a very hard form of money, you would say, because you know if something is easy to get and it becomes money, then people will just make more of it, and there will be more money, right? And so it is true that you can make gold, but it's hard to do. But the big difference with Bitcoin is that the supply of gold is actually able to respond to the price of gold. And so if we suddenly get $5,000 an ounce gold, 2 years from now, there's going to be a lot more gold mines in the world and a lot more production of gold. And so that supply of gold will actually go up and respond to that demand. But Bitcoin's unique in that no matter how high the price goes, there's no way for anyone to make any kind of decision to get more. It just gets more and more difficult to get as the price goes up. And so that's why we would say Bitcoin is the hardest money we've ever had.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so even according to Bill Gates, he says the future of money is digital currency. So now we're going to talk a little bit about proof of work, and then we're going to get into a Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, please start populating. You'll see the little Q&A box down there. So proof of work is pretty much the underlying mechanism behind how Bitcoin transactions are settled and the reason why mining is so popular. So proof of work basics, it's pretty much proof of work uses a deliberate and provably challenging mathematical algorithm to determine which party or which miner gets to validate the next block of Bitcoin's transactions. So it's basically trying to like force solve a very, very difficult equation, and whoever gets to solve that equation first gets a reward. So if anyone would have heard about that interesting term that came up recently called the halving. So Bitcoin's reward system actually cuts in half every so often. So the first time a block of Bitcoins was mined, you actually ended up getting 100 Bitcoins in
50 Bitcoins.
Was it 100?
No, it was 50 at the start.
Sorry. Okay, this is why you're here. And then after that, it cut in half to 25. And then after that, it cut in half to 12.5. So recently, a couple of weeks ago, it actually cut in half again to 6.25. So Dave, do you want to kind of talk about why that halving is actually an important part of Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of that fixed and agreed upon supply that we spoke about is actually designed to mimic the supply of gold. And so if you go back, hundreds or thousands of years ago, it was much easier to get gold. There were gold rushes in California and Alaska and whatnot where people were picking it off the ground, and essentially the easy gold was taken first. And that was the same was true with Bitcoin. So right now, we've already had, I think, about 18.5 million of the 21 million eventual Bitcoins issued. And so the new supply of Bitcoins is continually becoming more and more scarce. And it doesn't matter what happens to the price. It doesn't matter who wants more. That number is fixed. And so I had a conversation with Fred Pye, one of our corporate members yesterday, who runs the Bitcoin Fund. And they have actually, since the halving, bought more Bitcoins than have been mined. And so that's sort of and this is one party has bought more Bitcoins than have been mined in total. And so this is sort of this idea of this increasing scarcity that cannot respond to demand is why we've seen this, after every halving, we've had a massive price increase once the supply and demand catch up with each other. And that we have no idea whether that's going to happen again, but we can already see examples of the supply being insufficient to meet the demand.
No, very, very true. And then, so competitive. So in terms of being competitive, so miners compete with each other in attempt to validate transactions for blocks that arise. And one of the reasons that they compete with each other on that is one of the incentives that a miner has to support and secure the network. So I'm not sure if we explained that properly, but miners are part of what actually secure the Bitcoin network through proof of work, because of the fact that miners are the ones that validate the transactions. So if I have 1 Bitcoin and I want to send 1 Bitcoin to Dave, 4 miners, and I have no idea who they are, they're pretty much computers, have to validate that I actually have that 1 Bitcoin and that I'm sending that 1 Bitcoin to Dave. And as they're validating that transaction, their miners are also trying to force solve these functional equations to get a block reward. So they get a transaction fee, which helps support, and then they also get block rewards. So then your transaction, your send receive transaction, gets blocked into a block of data, and inside that block of data, that kind of creates that blockchain. So every single block that's mined, it could, I don't know how many transactions usually equals into a particular block of data, but there could be, 20 to 100 or more. But inside that block of data, there's going to be a unique digital fingerprint that's called a hash. And that unique digital fingerprint is going to go into the subsequent block of data. So if someone's trying to alter a blockchain, they're going to alter that unique digital signature. And because of that, the blocks of data are not going to accept that alteration, and it's going to kick it out. So miners are the ones that secure it, and it's very competitive to mine. People mine with multiple different types of equipment. So you can mine with what's called an ASIC, which is a very kind of simple, straightforward, plug and play device. Mining is expensive to do. Like, it takes the cost of the hardware as well as the electricity. The other type of mining is what I really what got me into Bitcoin specifically, was doing GPU-based mining. So I had a great friend, I think he's actually on our talk today. His name's Russ, and he taught me all about how to build miners. He got me into reading white papers. He helped me build out this little mining farm that we were doing at one point. And it was so much fun learning like the hands-on technical understanding how I was actually supporting the network through this style of mining. It's definitely more difficult mining, but it allows you to get into like more alternative coins than just Bitcoin. So then in terms of like incentivized, the winning party is rewarding with fraction of Bitcoin for their efforts for confirming, but also the block of Bitcoin for actually for doing this. So I think in today's rate, Bitcoin's about $13,000. So 6 times $13,000. So every time you mine a block, that's a fair chunk of change for any company. So even though that got cut in half, it'll be interesting to see how many miners actually stay on the network based on their reward cut going down. And then proportionate. So mining takes a large amount of the effort and the amount of Bitcoin received is proportion to the successful effort expended. So basically what that means is the more miners, the more you're going to get. So if you have one miner, in today's competitiveness, you're very, very, very unlikely to actually mine a single block of Bitcoin on your own, where you're better off putting that individual mine into what's called a pool mine. So the more effort, the more computer power that you have towards trying to force solve these equations, the better chances you are going to get that block reward. So individual mining isn't as competitive. There's like hobbyists, but the bigger you go, the better your reward. Yeah. Any thoughts on that one, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that it's crucially important that proof of work is difficult and competitive. And so there's a lot of sort of competing ideas around how we might reach consensus, things like proof of stake and whatnot. But the fact is that the one key feature that proof of work has is that it is taking value that someone is having to put in the form of electricity that they're buying and then putting in to try to seek that competitive reward. And so by chasing that carrot of that reward, we know that we have, in that 10-minute span, when that block is going to come out, we have that exact amount of value backing the security of the network. And with each new block that comes in, we have that much more value. And so essentially what you know is that if you want to make a transaction and we're trying to agree on this set of facts that is the state of the transactions, and you want to make, let's say, a 20 Bitcoin transaction, which is a pretty large transaction right now. You don't know who the miners are. They don't know who you are. Functionally, they could reverse that 20 Bitcoin transaction with one block. And in some cases, if they had, if they were the counterparty to that transaction, then it might actually make sense for the miners to reverse that. But what we can trust is that the miners are going to be self-interested. And right now, if you're doing a transaction under 6.25 Bitcoins, they would always rather take the 6.25 Bitcoins than try to screw with the network. And there's a whole bunch of other assumptions about why they might or might not ever try to screw with the network. But that rational self-interest in the short term is the very key core feature. And so in that example, if you wanted to do a 20 Bitcoin transaction, you would need to functionally wait about 40 minutes before you were 100% sure that transaction was final. And so the larger your transaction is, the longer you potentially have to wait, depending on how well you know the person you're transacting with and whatnot. Now, that's kind of a novel concept because there isn't really any other payment method that is ever final. You send a wire that can be reversed. You send cash is the next closest thing to final. Is you'd have to track them down and physically get the cash. But yeah, I guess that's the most important aspect of proof of work, and it's something that gets unfairly criticized, is the fact that they're not you're not using the computing power for something useful, or we're burning a lot of electricity. But those functions of proof of work are actually what make it secure, what give the value to that next block.
Yeah, definitely. And so that kind of explains this slide as well. Just in the image that you're going to see, these are GPU cards, graphics cards. Before mining, they were mainly used for gaming, or graphics rendering as well. But what's interesting is, as it's become more mainstream, there's actually companies now that are being traded on the stock exchange that are specifically mining companies. I believe, is Hunt 8 Mining Corp now on the stock exchange?
Yep, Hunt 8's on there, and Bitfarms is on there, I believe.
Which is really, really interesting. So it's definitely becoming a brave new world. So this one from Richard Branson, he said, I have invested in Bitcoin because I believe in its potential. The capacity to transform payments is very exciting. So I'd like to also explain that we're not giving anybody investment advice by watching this webinar. We're not telling you to run out and go buy Bitcoin. This is for informational purposes only, and we're trying to help you kind of understand what Bitcoin actually is, why people consider it money, the technology that's underlaying to it. So it's why we're not going to get into like kind of how to purchase it. But please do not take any of this as investment advice, just educational content to help you better understand what's actually happening and why people are so interested in this. So we're going to get into the Q&A part now. So I'm going to stop sharing our screen, gallery view. All right, so we have a few questions. I think that's the chat, sorry. Okay, so regarding the parity level with gold, can you go into a little more detail as to why this is significant and what this may mean in the future, i.e., does it mean that Bitcoin will be the backer of fiat currency? Well, I know Dave definitely has a thought process that Bitcoin is going to become the global reserve currency for the world. But so again, the reason why in the Bitcoin community we consider this a significant moment when it hit parity with gold, it's because of the fact that the gold standard had actually been around for 5,000 years. It's taken centuries for gold to actually hit the value that it hit and to be able to maintain the value that it has. And Bitcoin came to be what some would consider a digital version of gold. So the fact that from a digital perspective, you were able to do in 5,000 years something within less than a decade is fairly significant. The fact that it started off with absolutely zero value, like not even 0.00001 of a value, someone put value on it. The fact that the value of Bitcoin is completely based on community sentiment, completely based on what someone is willing to pay for it, which is really fascinating. It's the first type of barter and trade or currency, however you like to consider it, that is completely uncontrolled by the government. So that the value of it is not actually based on what the government considers the value of the dollar to be. It's completely based on the value of what the community sentiment believes it to be. And it's the top performing asset of the last 5 years. So there's nothing that's ever performed as well as Bitcoin. I'm sure Dave probably has something to add to that.
Yeah, and the second part of the question about backing fiat is interesting. I think there's a window right now where if one country in the world were to go to the equivalent of like the equivalent of the gold standard, but a Bitcoin standard, that country would probably be permanently the richest country in the world, I think. And going back to that that form of basing your entire economy on a form of hard money, of sound money, would change the entire decision-making process in the economy. You know, people would decide to spend a lot less, people would decide to save more, and people would buy things with a longer-term view in mind. And I think that's like, it's kind of cliche, but I think it was maybe Matt Odell, one of the pretty good podcasters who's also really good on Twitter, said a good quote from him recently was, "Fix the money, fix the world." And it may just be as simple as that.
Maybe. All right, so our next question is, what will the future look like when the last Bitcoin is mined? This one's really interesting because they actually create a time delay in Bitcoin. So out of 21 million Bitcoins, the last one cannot be mined until the year 2140. And so far, I believe about over 16 million Bitcoins have been mined, but they think anywhere from 4 to 6 million of those Bitcoins have actually been lost. So there won't actually be like 21 million in terms of like actual supply, but what the world would look like when the last Bitcoin is mined in 2140, I don't know. I think Dave wants a robot body. Can you tell me when he'll probably be alive by the last Bitcoin be mined with his robot body.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I was talking about that, like that amount of Bitcoin that's coming out being kind of like the security budget. That's how secure it is in the next 10 minutes is 6.25 Bitcoin's worth. And as the supply, the new supply of Bitcoins goes down, it halves every 4 years, as we discussed, that security budget goes down in a way. But the other factor is that every time a new block comes out, the miners get that that new issuance, but they also get all of the fees from all of the transactions that were on the network in that block. And so when you make a Bitcoin transaction, there's no fixed fee. You can add whatever fee you want, and the miners are incentivized to pick up the transactions with the highest fees first. And so if you want to, you can put like a 10,000th of a penny, and you'll end up probably waiting a little while for the miners to pick up your transaction, or you can put 50 cents and they'll probably pick it up pretty fast. That number, all of those 50 cents that aggregates to, has been growing. And so functionally that has grown with the usefulness of the network. The more people need to spend Bitcoin, the more people need to move it, the more they're willing to pay to do that. And so the general idea is that should keep increasing. I think we're probably going to see a point either in the next 4 or 8 years where those fees are actually worth more than the new block reward value that is issued. And so that's like the long-term thing, is that by the time we hit 2140, the Bitcoin network will either be incredibly useful or gone, I would think. And if it is incredibly useful, then people will be paying those fees, and that will be what supports the security of the network.
Awesome. All right. So another question is, what is most commonly purchased with Bitcoins right now?
Well, we don't know necessarily. The most common thing that people do with Bitcoin is they buy it to store it, to hold value, right? But in terms of spending Bitcoins, there are hundreds of thousands of retailers out there that do it, and we don't necessarily know what everyone is doing with it. But what we do know anecdotally is that people tend to use Bitcoin to plug holes in the payment infrastructure of the world right now. So we've had a lot of interesting stuff, like back when we had a store, we had a whole class of high school kids come in, and they needed to buy Bitcoins because they were doing a class trip. And the tour operator in Mexico, normally they take all these deposits in credit card, and then as the parents decide, no, you're not going on this trip, the parents just charge back the credit card. So the deposit is functionally useless. The guy, this little tour operator in Mexico, is just getting hit with chargebacks all the time. And so he had decided, you know what, we're doing our deposits only in Bitcoin. And the reason for that is because that's not a transaction that anyone can reverse, because there's no one in charge. And so this guy in Mexico had found this use case that no one had thought of. We ended up seeing this on the other end here in Canada. And there's like lots of those kinds of weird use cases that people find where either fees are too high, moving money around the world, transactions are reversible, or areas where there's like financial censorship is also very relevant. So we don't really know, but like it's sort of evolving naturally in that sense. It's not really like a super useful competitor to like Visa. You know what I mean? It's pretty much fine to go to the store and pay with your Visa. There's no like user experience benefit to using Bitcoin. It's more like we're talking about that continuum of the history of money. We've gotten to a very good point on the technology and how to exchange the value. What we're improving now is how to store the value.
All right, so another one. So what exchanges and wallets would you recommend using? So in terms of wallets, I have one recommendation specifically, and it would be a Cold Card. It was invented by a Canadian. His name's Rodolfo. He's out of Toronto. And it is definitely the most secure thing I've ever seen. I attended the Honey Badger conference last year in Riga, Latvia, and watched the presentation on it. And I don't think there's anything more secure. And they integrate with online wallets like Wasabi Wallet. But the reason the Cold Card's so interesting is because the wallet never has to touch, like the actual physical device never actually has to touch your computer or the internet to be able to store the coins, which makes it like absolutely ultimately secure. In terms of exchanges, of course, we just talked about BitVo earlier, so I would recommend BitVo as an exchange. And I see exchanges as kind of like on-off ramps. So if you'd like to purchase it, right? Or if you'd like to trade with it, right? Exchanges are great. If you're looking for a long-term store of value, BitVo is great because it's also associated with DC Bank. I would look at, if you're Canadian, specifically look at Canadian exchanges. They're working very diligently to make sure that they are IROC compliant and working with their CSA or their ASC, the Alberta Securities Commission, things like that. I don't recommend the more shady exchanges, especially ones that specifically aren't Canadian, like Binance and stuff like that. If anything happens to your coins, it's unlikely that you'd be able to recoup them. And I've seen so many exchanges kind of that aren't Canadian kind of go that way. Although Einstein was a Canadian one that wasn't great either. So Bitvo, I like. I've never seen anything happen poorly with them. I think, Dave, there was one other one that you liked.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of good ones. Bull Bitcoin's a good one.
They're okay, but that's not an exchange.
Yeah, well, no, it's kind of similar. I think I would break that down into there's two reasons that you might want an exchange or a brokerage, and one of them is to move in and out of Bitcoin as an on and off ramp to buy and sell, and then the other one is to trade if you're like wanting to get into day trading or playing the highs and lows and whatnot. I would do those two things separately personally. The on and off ramps, I would agree with everything you said in terms of picking a Canadian company. You know, there's a bunch of great Canadian companies that buy and sell Bitcoins.
CoinSquare.
Yeah, well, CoinSquare wouldn't be my first choice, but Bitvo certainly is a good choice. Bitcoin Solutions, Bull Bitcoin. We've got some other local ones that are good too. And the big key there is that if you want to buy some Bitcoins, take them off the exchange. And some exchanges will offer you to hold those Bitcoins. I wouldn't hold any Bitcoins on any of these exchanges that you would use as an on and off ramp. Now, if you did want to trade, you shouldn't, first of all, unless you're actually a professional at trading in your other life, because trading is a net, there's no net gain to the system from trading. And so there are professional traders who make money trading from people who think they know about trading and don't. But the functionally best place to trade is an exchange called BitMEX, which is just it's one of the most liquid financial products in the world, is the Bitcoin futures on BitMEX. And so if you do trade, which you shouldn't, that's what I would use.
Actually, so one of the things I like about Bull Bitcoin is that they are actually non-custodial. And what that means is when you send the money to Bull Bitcoin, of course, they have like their KYC and their AML and all that. They do not hold your Bitcoin. So when you set up an account, you have to put in a wallet, because the second you send in the funds and execute and say, this is how much Bitcoin I want to buy, it has to go to your wallet. So they'll never hold it on their exchange for you, which makes it non-custodial, which also make them extremely compliant with all the regulations that are coming out right now. Okay, so someone said, thank you for the great presentation. What's the factors that decide the value price of Bitcoin? So again, very much supply and demand and community sentiment. So I'd argue like your house, you might buy your house for $500,000 and you think your house had $500,000 value, but unless someone's willing to buy your house from you at $500,000, your house does not have that level of value. So it really is dependent on what the market's willing to pay. And what I love, like to me, Bitcoin is kind of like money for the people. Like it's completely decentralized. It's the fact that you can't control it. It's anybody can have access to it. Every single person can have some Bitcoin. So like Bitcoin, you don't have to just buy one whole Bitcoin. You don't spend 13 grand on one. It goes into what they call a Satoshi. So it goes back 8 decimal places. So you can have a fraction of it. So it means everyone in the world can have a little bit of Bitcoin if they choose to have it. But again, it's the more people that buy it versus, you know, how much exists, supply, demand. That's kind of how I'd look at it. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, it's very simple. It's just supply and demand. And there's a lot of factors that go into determining what the demand is, but we know exactly what the supply is. And so it's just a matter of one of the most free and open markets in the world using organic price discovery. And that's what we see.
Ooh, this one feels like a charged question. What are your thoughts on the direction Bill Gates and his foundations are playing, wanting tracking chips, viruses, birth suppression, and oh shit, I don't believe they accept the competing currency. You know, I'm gonna abstain from talking about this.
Okay.
My thoughts are probably very controversial.
Okay. So I don't think there's very many people out there who want tracking chips in them. I haven't ever heard of someone who's like, yeah, sign me up for that. We don't know where the world's going to go in that sense. And it doesn't matter if Bill Gates or Facebook or the European Union or the World Bank comes up with a new form of money, because if someone is issuing it, someone will be in control and someone can always make more. And that's the biggest key differentiating factor with Bitcoin. I think what will actually happen, we talked briefly about censorship resistance there. And if we do devolve into a further dystopian nightmare where we have to have tracking chips, where you get your fake tracking chips, you will probably pay in Bitcoin. And it will, it's a way to opt out. It's a way to opt out of the money, and it's a way to opt out of all of the consequences of the money that the existing system imposes on us.
And really, realistically, why do you need a tracking chip? I mean, people are letting themselves get tracked every freaking which way from Sunday. You got your watches, you got your phones, you got your laptops. I mean, like, you got your car with its GPS. I mean, realistically, like, if they want to find you, they're going to find you. Okay, so great presentation. Why do you think Bitcoin will be the most prominent cryptocurrency and won't lose dominance as other newly digital currencies iterate on the technology? Okay, really, really basic question, or simple answer to this. Bitcoin has sound money principles and is a decentralized currency. Everything else that's come on the market, and I mean everything from your Ripple, which is pure crap, to your Tron, which is just scary, to your Verge coin, to your Litecoin, which is a ripoff of Bitcoin's white paper. Doesn't matter what other currency it is a centralized form of money, and anything that's centralized can be manipulated, can be recreated, can be double spent, can get inflation, can be like stolen. Like, it is the reason why Bitcoin's lasted as long as it has is because it's extremely secure. It follows sound money principles. It follows Austrian economics, and it's just the best version we've ever seen. Everyone else has tried to compete. A lot of what they're doing is like, hey, check out my blockchain. I'm incentivizing my blockchain with token economics. And if you use my blockchain and use my token, I'm going to like arbitrage it and make all this money off of trading it on exchanges. And that's the get rich quick scheme, which is really unfortunate. So that's why I really don't trust the other coins that are out there, because of the fact that they just have just nothing that makes them actual money.
Yeah, and they mentioned iterating on the technology, and it's very easy to get sucked into that argument of like, this coin is faster or this coin does this other technological feat, but those are all sort of secondary. There's a lot of ways that you can move Bitcoin other than just interacting directly with the Bitcoin network. The really important feature is that decentralization, and I think that's kind of impossible to recreate, because if you look at like the number 2 through the number 10 biggest coins that are out there, all of those coins have someone who founded them who is in charge. And
Ethereum.
Most of those coins, the person who founded them is a billionaire because of the fact that they founded them, if not, hundreds of millions at least. And it was kind of this unique, almost like immaculate conception where whoever created Bitcoin created it in a time when there's no way they could have known the potential value. And so they left tens of billions at this point of dollars on the table. And that's not something that you can ever get someone to do again, I don't think. I don't think there's going to be this benevolent founder that somehow creates a harder form of money. And now whoever Satoshi is or was has been gone for a very long time. Even if they came back, they wouldn't be in charge. There's no one in charge, and there's no way for someone new to take control. And that is the big key. It's not the technology, it's not how fast it goes, it's just that no one is in charge. And that's why
Craig Wright is not Satoshi.
And Craig Wright is not Satoshi. Yeah, that's permanent. That's the biggest difference that none of the other currencies can ever recreate.
Yeah. And I know it can be kind of confusing because you have like, so Craig Wright did like Bitcoin Satoshi's vision, so BSV or whatever. They're like, no, I truly knew what I wanted to do, and I didn't do it right in Bitcoin, so I'm going to do it right here. No, that is horse squabble. And then you had like Roger Ver, who forked Bitcoin, was like, no, now I'm going to do Bitcoin Cash. That's how it's supposed to be, faster transactions, all of that. But anytime someone's forked it and moved over, it's never been able to properly compete with Bitcoin. It's never had the mining support. It's never had the community sentiment. It's just not, it's not Bitcoin, and it's because of the fact that it's controlled by someone. All right, so I think, what's the next one? Okay, so how is Bitcoin lost, and what are options to recover lost Bitcoin? Okay, so when I talk about the ones that are lost, there's a really interesting story, and I feel so bad for this family. But many years ago, probably back in 2012 or 2013, this guy was just pretty much a hobbyist. He was mining Bitcoins, and his wife was just grinding his gears about it. It's like, why are you doing this? Complete waste of money, yada, yada, yada. And he actually threw his Bitcoin mining equipment and the hardware wallet that he was using and literally just dumped it into a landfill, or landfill. And it's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars today in Bitcoin, that unless someone went and tried to scrounge that landfill, is pretty much lost. The thing is, when you lose your seed key, or you lose your private key, you lose your password, you have really at this point no way of recovering it, which is why it's so critically important that if you're going to look into purchasing crypto, like a Bitcoin, you want to understand security. If you're the kind of person that opens an email from someone that you don't know that could be a phishing scheme, don't buy Bitcoin. If you're the kind of person who answers a fake call from the CRA who says they're going to put you in jail unless you give them some money or send them some gift cards, don't buy Bitcoin, right? If you're the kind of person who's like, I want to be lazy about this and leave it on an exchange, don't buy Bitcoin. If you want to have it, then understanding privacy, understanding security, understanding cold storage, hardware wallets, and making sure that above all, you keep your private key safe, your cipher key, your password, you make sure you keep that so it's recoverable. That is paramount. It's part of that self-sovereign banking. It's the ownership of your own money, the control of your own money. The second you leave it on an exchange, you're leaving the control of your money to someone else. The second you give your private key away, you're giving it to someone else. So like a real world example to maybe help for people who might not be so familiar with this, you have a debit card. I wonder if I have one right here. No, I don't have it. So you have like a debit card and you have a PIN code. So when your debit card, anyone can see your debit card, you go to the store, you use your debit card, that's kind of like your public face for your money. But your PIN code, the thing that they tell you don't give out, don't let anyone see your PIN code, that's kind of like your private key. So when you put it in, it's pretty much the debit card doesn't have money on the actual card. It just has access to a line of code in the bank that said there's this much funds available, and using your PIN gives you access to that digital line of code. So when you have Bitcoin, you have a public key, and a public key basically is like your debit card. Anyone can see it. It means that there's this much Bitcoin sitting in this address. Now it's alphanumeric and 26 digits, so no one knows who actually has it. But your private key is like your PIN card. So the second you give that up, the second you hand your Bitcoins on to someone else or put in an exchange or even into an online wallet, you're giving your PIN code away. So you're giving your control of your money away. So it's very important that people understand this, because people who don't get it are usually the ones that lose their Bitcoins. They leave it on like Mt. Gox, Einstein, Quadratica, whatever that is. And someone who has the central authority and control over your private keys, over your coins, are able to take it, right? So very, very important for that. Dave, anything to add?
No, I think that's pretty much it. It's kind of the double-edged sword of if no one's in charge, there's no one you can call to fix something for you when you screw something up. So don't lose your password, don't lose your coins.
Nope. And also, if you leave it in a safety deposit box, I know a lot of people are like, oh, just put it in a safety deposit box. The bank actually owns the contents of your safety deposit box. Not everybody knows this. So if you put your Bitcoin, your seed key in that bank vault or in that safety deposit box, it's actually the bank's. And if anything happens to the bank, they have the right to take it. There's one guy who's been in court for about a decade because the bank literally went into a safety deposit box and took his gold and still hasn't given it back. And it's been a very long court case. So it's not the place that I would recommend to put your public private keys, hardware wallet, anything like that. Anything you put there is no longer yours. Read the fine print. So next, obviously Bitcoin is a threat to central banking and government. What is the biggest threat to Bitcoin becoming banned or prohibited by the government? The government cannot ban or prohibit something it cannot control. So much like the prohibition.
It can't really ban anything, to be honest. The idea that governments can ban anything is a joke.
No. Very, very hard. They tried to do a prohibition on liquor. That didn't work. They tried to do it on weed. They eventually had to succumb to that one too. It's absolutely not possible for them to do it. And it's because of the fact that, like, right now, if the government tried to figure out if you had Bitcoin, unless you bought it on an exchange that had KYC, AML, unless you didn't purchase it in cash or nobody knows who owns what wallet. It's very, 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 very difficult to figure that out, if at all possible. So governments can't regulate something that they can't actually control. And what they're trying to do right now to figure out who has Bitcoin is regulating the exchanges and the on-off ramps to do the KYC and the AML, so they can get a list and record of who actually has what or who's purchased what to get an idea about it, because they can't do it to the individual wallet. So it's not possible to control it as long as there's methods to purchase it that the government doesn't have access to. All right, so next question. Are there any digital currencies that you would consider investing in besides Bitcoin?
No. And it's the way I would phrase that also, Bitcoin's not really an investment. People treat it that way. They buy it to sell it for more next month. But what you're really doing is just holding your wealth. It's not an investment any more than sitting on cash is an investment. Bitcoin is a way to hold your wealth for a longer period of time. So it's the money that you want to use if you don't want to spend your money very soon.
All right, so next, how do you protect your private key? Can you back it up, store it in multiple locations? Okay, so I found Cold Card really, really fascinating. Ton of fun to set up. Thank God I had my friend to help me do it. It was just quite an ordeal. But in terms of like protecting your private key, it's not the alphanumeric private key so much that you're trying to protect as the cold storage wallet, or if you're using a ledger, if you're using a Trezor, if you're using a Cold Card, they're going to get you to write down anywhere from 12 to 24 words. It's considered a cipher. And as long as you have that cipher, you can reclaim your Bitcoin from another version of that cold storage device. In terms of protecting the cipher, personally, I would recommend, if you're writing it down on paper, get it laminated, because over time paper can deteriorate or you might not be able to like read the words as well. Put it in something that you consider very, very safe. So if you have, you know, a safe in your home that's not obvious to people, that's like bolted into the ground and difficult to move and is fireproof and waterproof, that's a really great way. Some people use multiple lawyers. So you can go to like a couple different law firms. One can have one half of your seed key, another law firm, because they have their own like ways of securing things. Another can have the other half of it. Another can have your actual hardware wallet. And as long as any one lawyer doesn't have access to, you know, two of the three pieces, you're pretty much, it's a very, very secure way of doing it. I know one person who did it in like multiple parts of multiple law firms across Canada. So like, how the hell are you going to get access to that? It's very difficult.
And how much work you want to put into it, really it would be determined by how much value you have in there, right? And like for most people, especially if you're getting into it relatively new, you don't need to go to extreme lengths. There's a group of really good people in the city that would be happy to help. I'd recommend showing up to the meetups if you're in Calgary.
YYC Bitcoin's a great meetup for that as well. So again, the amount that you have is the difficulty. If you're only holding a couple $100, I mean,
just keep it in your phone. If you have a couple $100,
you can have it in your phone. You can have it like Exodus is an online wallet. I mean, for a couple $100, If you are starting to get into like a half a Bitcoin or a whole Bitcoin, I would highly recommend getting into like an actual like cold storage wallet if you plan on holding it long term. Mainly just because at some point it might be worth more than 13. right? It could go up in value as it's continued to do every single year. So, but yeah, those are two options for protecting it. One, to extreme levels. I wouldn't do that extreme level unless I had a lot of it, or the, you know, safe in your home. I just wouldn't put it in a bank. Absolutely not. And I wouldn't leave it in unlaminated paper. And I wouldn't create a ton of copies of it, because you lose a copy, someone else gets that, they have access to your Bitcoin. So that's not also a great idea. If you sell a Bitcoin, do you have to pay capital gains?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. If you sell anything and you make money on it, you have to pay capital gains.
Yes. All right. With each halving, does the incentive to mine Bitcoin decrease?
Yeah, I mean, it does.
The transaction fees could increase, though.
Yeah, there's two kinds of incentives to mine Bitcoins. So there is the incentive to begin mining Bitcoins, and there's the incentive to continue mining Bitcoins. And so if you have a big mining farm set up and you are making a profit at Bitcoin at the current price with the current output and your current power costs, then you have an incentive that is ongoing to keep mining Bitcoins. Other people might also have the incentive to start. In a situation like right now, where all of those miners basically had their income cut in half a few weeks ago, there's less incentive for new people to start, and there is still less incentive for people to mine on an ongoing basis because their margins are lower. And so we might see some of them stop, and the network self-adjusts for that. So if people stop mining Bitcoins, the rewards for everyone else who is mining Bitcoin proportionally goes up. So it's kind of a self-regulating system. And then the flip side of it is, over the longer period of time, what we've seen is every time it cuts in half, because of that pressure on the supply, the dollar value of the coins that you mine has gone way up each time. And so what ends up happening is you end up making more in dollars, 18 months from now than you did anyway. So we don't know if that'll happen again, but that's kind of the assumption that a lot of miners are working on.
Yeah. So for the next question, is a 51% attack a threat or risk to Bitcoin? So a couple schools of thought on that. My thought personally is there is no true financial incentive to attack Bitcoin. And the reason being, if you're trying to perform a 51% attack, which just means that you have 51% of the hashing power, potentially the risk there is that you would be able to alter certain pre-mined blocks. You could alter data in it to be able to reproduce or create more Bitcoin, something like that. The lack of incentive is, once people know that the network has been compromised, the value of Bitcoin is going to crash. And it's going to cost you probably $1 billion in computer equipment to buy enough hardware to be able to gain enough of the network to be able to perform this. So why would someone spend that much money to watch the investment go to nothing? Because it would going to trust the network after.
It would, at this point, it would require several $1 billion of both hardware costs and infrastructure costs. And you couldn't actually, with a 51% attack, create new Bitcoins, breaking the rules. What you could do is you could reverse a recent transaction. And so the only transaction that would be worth reversing at the cost of several $1 billion would be a several $1 billion transaction. And so unless there's some kind of multi-billion dollar transaction happening on Bitcoin where all of the miners are somehow counterparty to it, no one would ever really have an incentive to do that.
Yeah, no. So the last question, I know we've gone over on time and we've had so many people stay for this, so thank you guys all for staying. Okay, so did I see that BTC split? Isn't that the same as making more coins? Okay, so I'm not 100% sure exactly what the reference is there, but you might be, if you're thinking split, you might be thinking fork. So things that have forked Bitcoin before and kind of like split from the main network to create their own would be Bitcoin SV is a fork or a split from Bitcoin. They created their own coins. They are not Bitcoins. I would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. There's Bitcoin Cash. That's another fork. Darkcoin, which is now Dash, was also a bit of a split from Bitcoin. Litecoin is also a fork and split. So many have kind of like taken because it's open sourced, you can literally take the code from Bitcoin and do anything you want with it on top of that. But whatever you do does not actually alter Bitcoin in and of itself. You're just creating something new and using pre-existing software to do it.
Yeah, Bitcoin, like any other money, is an agreement, and what everything that we've described is accomplishing is maintaining that agreement, and the agreement that is Bitcoin has never forked. Other people have formed other agreements like Bitcoin SV, Bitcoin Cash, and they use the word Bitcoin in a deliberate attempt to confuse people on that point, but those actually have nothing to do with Bitcoin. They're not Bitcoin.
All right, well, we are all out of questions and have gone on for 90 minutes. So, oh, actually, is this another one? Sorry, we have one more. Bitcoin seems to Bitcoin seems too volatile to use as payment. Which countries and industries accept Bitcoin instead of cash payment? Okay, so Bitcoin is volatile, yes. But in terms of countries, there are pretty much any country in the world, there's going to be someone who's going to accept Bitcoin instead of a cash payment. There's some countries I would, just personally encourage to get on Bitcoin as their currency as opposed to what they currently have. Those would be like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, just to help to stabilize their currencies. But there's nowhere in the world, unless it's somewhere that literally does not have access to the internet or technology, period, that probably won't have some method for accepting Bitcoin.
Yeah, I would say what I had said earlier is Bitcoin is really good money for people who don't need to spend it soon. Yeah. If you want to spend your money soon, then just leave it in dollars and it won't matter that much.
Absolutely. And there's also some great resources. Like I'd highly recommend checking out BTC Sessions. He has great YouTube videos, really good for getting like anyone to understand Bitcoin specifically. Other ones, great meetups. So again, YYC Bitcoin, you can find them on Telegram. They are a great resource, great community, lots of miners in there who like to talk about things. Again, the Canadian Blockchain Consortium, you're welcome to reach out to us at any time if you want to learn more. Again, other things that we've talked about. So like Bitcoin is a great local exchange to go to. Bitcoin Solutions, another great local one that has ATMs all across Alberta and Canada. And then Bull Bitcoin, great non-custodial brokerage that you can go to. Definitely do your research again. I highly recommend that. This is an investment advice. Bitcoin is not so much an investment as a store of wealth as some would consider it. So if you're interested in learning more, there's some great resources out there to look into. If you want to ask us what some resources are, you can email info@canadablockchain.ca and we'll be happy to send you some links. So thank you so much for joining us today. Our next webinar topic is going to be on June 11th. And we're going to be talking about the roadmap for recovery for startups. So I've been in the startup world for a long time, very passionate about startups. We're going to have the CEO of Startup Canada. We're going to have the CEO of Platform Calgary and some other great people talking about how we can support our entrepreneurs moving forward. So thank you again so much for being here today. And I hope we see you guys at our next webinar.